Hi, my name is Dean, and I'd like to introduce you to the Nette web development framework. I really like this framework. I think it hits the sweet spot between the larger command line driven frameworks like Ruby on Rails, Django, and Laravel, and those on the other end of the spectrum, the micro frameworks like Flask, Sinatra, and Slim. It seems to me it includes all the components you'll need to make a great web application, and it doesn't do anything to stand between you and the code, which I really like. I appreciate what they have to say here. Real programmers don't use frameworks. They write web applications through the command line straight to the server. Hats off to them. For the rest of us, Nette is a great help to our work, and I think you'll find that that's true. All right, let's take a look at the app we'll be building together. And I've created a little website I call the Podcast Collective, and I've cobbled together a Bootstrap 5 theme here. Yeah, not much to look at, but this is definitely not a tutorial in website design. But I think it's great to work with the CSS framework, even if you're just going through a tutorial. So here it is. So the idea is Nette includes a component for building out user authentication and authorization. So I've started that kind of primitive at this point, but just to give you an idea of how it works, you can sign in to the site. Whoop. And once you signed in, you'll notice that the links for sign up and sign in have changed, and now you can reach your collection. And so I've started a collection here. And basically this is a podcast list, which is just a podcast title and a little commentary about each podcast. We're just going to go through some basic CRUD functionality to see how Nette works. And basically the notion is you can add new ones, you can edit existing ones, and of course you can delete from your list. You might notice here that we're issuing AJAX requests. I'm using the HTMX library to accomplish that, and I really like HTMX. It really helps save a lot of time in working with AJAX requests to the server, and it prevents whole page refreshes, which are kind of a thing of the past. It's a much better user experience when you're just refreshing portions of the page, in this case this div that's in the center. I put in this little dad joke here just because I like dad jokes, and I just wanted to be sure with the use of this card that I wasn't refreshing the whole page. I wanted to see that for myself. All right. So in order to work with Nette, you are going to need a LAMP server. You'll need Apache, MySQL, or the MariaDB, as well as PHP 8. I'm using XAMPP, and I really like it. I think if you can find it, if you want it, you can find it here at ApacheFriends.org. I found the links to the installers. The installers work great for Linux. I hope that they will work just as well for Windows and OS X. Once you have that installed, you'll need to cruise on back to nette.org and install the framework. Basically, you're just installing a folder on the web server document root. You can follow along, find out a little bit more about Nette and why it's great to use, and finally create your first application. We'll go through the steps just to get to the folder installed at the web server root. All right, some instructions here about where to get the application. You're going to need an IDE and the plugins. I'm using Visual Studio Code, and the plugins they suggested here were very helpful. The recommended method for installing Nette is to use Composer. If you don't have access to Composer, you can simply download the folder and extract it into your web server root. The web server root in my setup here is going to be, if I can find it, is here. It is in opt lamp htdocs. I've already downloaded and extracted the folder and renamed it to Podcast Collective. You will need some instructions about how to change ownership and file permissions, and those can be found right here. Once you've installed XAMPP, you can cruise to localhost. The dashboard will pop up, and you'll find some how-to guides. And the two that I found the most helpful were, first of all, you will want to likely configure a virtual host. That's really helpful. And then, changing the read and getting read-write access to the web server document root directory. Okay, so once you've completed those steps, you'll have one more configuration change that might be helpful, and that is here back at nette.org. You're going to want to configure write privileges to a couple of folders that are in the file podcast collective, and the instructions are right here. And again, that's pretty straightforward at the command line. It probably only applies to Linux and OS X users. All right. So if you've done everything right, and I bet you did, when you go to your virtual host, and in my case, I've named that podcast collected.test, you'll see the pre-configured homepage here in Nette. And the first order of business for us is going to be to write some code to replace this and understand a little bit more about how Nette works. And that'll be coming up next. Thanks. All right, we're in Visual Studio Code, and we're all set to make our first presenter. But I recognize that probably begs the question, well, what in the world is a presenter? Well, here's what Nette has to say about that. If you've used a web development framework before, you're likely familiar with the model view controller design pattern. Well, it looks like Nette simply renamed that to model view presenter design pattern. And so the notion here is that we're going to divide our code into three separate layers. The model layer, which is responsible for accessing the database and creating queries and creating data objects. The presenter is responsible for accessing those data objects from the model, applying whatever application logic makes sense, and then passing on that information to the view layer. And the view layer is responsible for rendering HTML to the web browser. So the notion is we're trying to divide our code up into three parts as best we can. I recognize that that's pretty abstract right now, but I think it'll make a lot more sense as we move on with the tutorial and creating our application. So, all right, back to Visual Studio Code. We're in the Podcast Collective folder. I've opened that folder. Most of the work that we will be doing is in the app directory. I've already opened up the presenter folder. And in that folder, I've created our first presenter called Landing Page Presenter. Again, if you've worked in web development frameworks before, you probably already know that where you put files and folders is absolutely important. Things are just not going to work out right if you don't put things in the right place and give them the right capitalization and the right naming conventions. In the case here, all presenters will go in the presenter folder. Originally, there was only one. It was one that we've seen so far, and it's the homepage presenter, and it looks like this. And that's just not enough for me to be able to walk you through what's going on. There's a fair amount going on behind the scenes here a little bit. So we're going to make one, and we're going to replace the homepage presenter eventually with this landing page presenter. I'm going to go ahead and paste in some code because watching me type while I'm trying to talk is going to be pretty miserable for you and for me too. So I think it'll just be easier to paste that in there, and I'll walk you through what's going on. All right, we're going to declare strict types because that kind of makes sense. Good discipline there. We need to create a namespace called app presenter so we can find this presenter. We're going to use the framework, use Nette, and we're going to create a class called landing page presenter, which extends Nette's presenter. So that's basically what we're doing. A lot of it is extending existing classes. All right, we're going to create a message property. We're going to put an access modifier private because we're not going to be needing it outside of this class, and we're going to give it a default value of welcome to the podcast collective. Obviously, normally we wouldn't do that. We'd be connecting to a model, but right now we haven't created a model. So we'll just to see what's going on between the presenter and the view layer, we'll just put in a default value. We create our first method here called render welcome. Again, the way that's created and spelled is really important. We're going to use the render functionality, and we need to call it welcome. That will be the name of our template, which is the view component in the world of Nette. And we're going to assign the message variable in the template to be our message, this message. Okay, so pretty simple, but it's going to be doing a lot for us, and I'll show you what that's all about. The last thing we need to do is create a Latte template, and Latte again is the extension for the templating engine we'll be using. And it's important again that they go in the right location. Under the presenter folder, there's a folder called templates. And in templates right now, there's only one. I've created a new folder for landing page. That's important. Under template, we're going to create a landing page folder. And finally, in landing page, we're going to create one called welcome.latte. So the new folder is called welcome.latte. Okay, so we have that. All right, and I'm going to go ahead and type a little bit in here. I think I can manage okay, just because it'll be faster. It might be even faster than pasting it in. Latte has these braces to hold variables, and that helps a lot. Kind of pseudocode, and we named our variable message. All right, and we'll end that tag. All right, and if we save everything, we'll be ready to go here. Okay, so let's go on back out to our virtual host, and we've called it podcastcollective.test. And now we're going to use these URL segments to find our presenter and our method. And its landing page, and the method was called welcome. I hope I spelled it right. All right, there we go. And there it is. It worked. So what's really great about the way this works, and most web development frameworks work, is that we're matching the segments of the URL to a controller, more specifically here, a presenter and a method. And as you can see here, and this is the Tracy debugger. This is really helpful. You can see what's going on here. We're calling in the URL segments the presenter, landing page, and the method welcome. It's really looking for the class called landing page, but it's getting there by opening up the file called landing page presenter. And I've got to tell you, I've been doing this development stuff for a long time, and when we first started, back when the web was young and untamed, just getting to this was so difficult. There wasn't a lot of discipline in what we were doing. Lots of HTML thrown in with a lot of PHP and a lot of JavaScript. And boy, just getting your URLs to work correctly was quite a task. So this makes things a lot easier. Now I know right now it may not seem that way. It seems like we wrote a lot of code to get to welcome to the podcast collective, but there's much more to follow, and I think all of the components will begin to make sense as we're working along. The next thing we're going to do is create a model, so we can connect a presenter to a data object from a model, and then pass that all along to a Latte template to have it correctly rendered to the web page, or to the web browser. All right, hang on, we'll do some more. We're ready to begin creating our model, but before we do that, we've got to create a database and seed it with a table and some data, so that our data object will have something in it. So if you'll go over to localhost and you'll pop into dashboard, the XAMPP dashboard, and off to the right is a link to phpMyAdmin. Log in with your database user name and password. All right, here we are. I've already created one, and I've called mine my database Podcast Collective, and it's got a pretty simple setup here. It's got one table called podcasts, and it structures really brief, just 3 columns. The first is ID, it'll be an integer, and it'll be an auto increment field, and it will be our primary key. The next is title, and that's a varchar 255 for length, and finally content, and that'll be text. I've already put some items in here. I'll show you those. Just 3: fresh air, daily dad jokes, and the problem with John Stewart. And I've just populated them with a little lorem ipsum in the content field, just to give him something in there. If these aren't your 3 favorites, please do pick 3 of your own, and we'll get going on creating that model. All right, so back into Visual Studio Code. You'll need to create a folder for models, and that's right under the app directory. And inside models, create your first model, and we're calling these models facades. In our case, podcast facade.php. And facade was kind of a new term to me, but my understanding it means a simplified interface to more complex set of library or or set of classes, and that's really true. We need to have access to the Explorer class in our class, and that leads us to the notion of our kind of dealing with dependency injection here, and I'll walk you through how that works. So in this class, our namespace is app models. We're using the framework. We're creating a class called podcast facade, and podcast facade has a dependency on this class Explorer. So essentially, we have an object when this is instantiated as an object on this object when that class is instantiated as an object. So in order to do that, we're going to employ what's called constructor injection. And you may already know that in PHP, the constructor method, which is called with __ construct, is a special method, what's called a magic method. And what's really going on is whenever this class is called, whenever this class, we're creating an instance of this class, the first thing that this class will do is run this function. Whatever's in construct, that's the first thing that happens. And so what we want to happen with constructors is we need to get access to an instance of Explorer. And we're putting that in, we're declaring our dependencies as parameters of the construct or the constructor method, putting it inside these parentheses. And that's really a great idea. That's a way of implementing dependency injection, and it makes it really clear what our dependencies are and where to find them. It makes the code a little cleaner. It makes debugging and testing potentially a little bit easier, and it's kind of it's an elegant way of getting what we need, which is if I'm going to have any kind of podcast facade, I really got to get to all of the methods that are in Explorer. And that's what we're doing next. We're saying, hey, I'm assigning this value to our declared property database. I'm using the this keyword so that I can use it inside my class. And finally, I'm creating a function called getAllPodcasts, which returns this database, which is our instance of Explorer. And I'm looking for the table method inside Explorer. The table method will read the table we're asking for. The parameter here is podcast, so it'll read the table of podcasts, and then getAllPodcasts will at last deliver a data object that can be used by our presenter. So in very few lines of code, we have access to the Explorer contents or all the methods in Explorer, and Explorer is a pretty big deal. It's got a lot going on in there. And I really like this method that Nette uses, and I think you'll find it pretty handy. So the next thing to do is we need to make some changes to the podcast presenter and to the welcome latte template, and we'll do that in the next part. Before we edit our landing page presenter and our welcome.latte files, we need to update two configuration files in the config directory. And the first one I have open here, local.neon. What we need to do is add an entry for our database connection. And basically we need the data server name. MySQL host is 127.0.0.1, and our database name is Podcast Collective. We need to include the root user and the root user password if you created one. The second one we need to change is in the configuration is services.neon. And we have to add this line. App models podcast facade. We need to have podcast facade as a service in Nette. Basically, this tells Nette where to find podcast facade and make sure it works correctly. So once you've changed those two configuration files, we're ready to take a look at the landing page presenter and make the changes we need to make good use of our newly created data object. So here we go. This is the old one where we had a property with a default value of welcome to the podcast collective. And we're going to change this up because now we have a data object. We'll paste that one in. And here we go. I'll walk you through this one. So we're going to use namespace app presenters, of course, and then app models podcast facade because we now created that model. Our landing page presenter class name hasn't changed. We're still extending the base presenter from Nette. we've got a new property here, declared property facade. And oh, hey, look, there's a constructor method, underscore construct. We're using that because an instance of landing page presenter depends on an instance of podcast facade. And the way we're going to do that is we're going to use dependency injection using a constructor injection kind of method here. We're going to pass our dependency as a parameter to the constructor, and then we're going to assign it to this value here. We're going to use the this keyword so we can use our newly instantiated facade in our class. And then we're going to create a function called render welcome, or update the function render welcome, so that the template will now have a new variable called podcasts, and podcasts will be the value of the method get all podcasts that we find from our instance of podcast facade. So there it is. We've used dependency injection again, and in a few short lines we've got access to our data object that we get when we use the method get all podcasts. Okay, so one more file to change here, and that is the welcome.latte, our template file here, which is under our landing page folder, which is under our presenters folder. A couple of new things here. I've already updated this one. Block content. If you haven't used a templating engine before, this is a pretty common feature, and the notion is that we have this @layout.latte file, and I'll open that one up. And basically, this is just all the boilerplate stuff that every web page needs. And instead of writing it out every single time, you simply you'll be including the content that you create in your latte files. Will be included right here. So when you run welcome.latte, you get the layout.latte as a bonus, and it will include all of the layout.latte stuff plus this block content in the center of the layout.latte. All right, so you get them as a team, which is kind of nice. You don't have to type out as much boilerplate. Okay, so now we're going to give it a title, Podcast Collective, and here's a function, some functionality from the templating engine Latte, pretty typical stuff here. We're going to be able to kind of loop over our data. We're going to add our podcast variable here as podcast. So for each podcast as a podcast, we're going to grab the title, and we're going to grab the content, and we're going to loop over them all until we run out, and then we're going to end the for each loop, and then we'll also end the block, and that'll be all mushed in with our layout, and it'll all show up as one thing in the web browser. Okay, so if we've done everything right, nice, and I remember to save all the files, and we go back out to our virtual host and our URL segments here. Let's make sure it's still working. Oh, look at that. So as you remember, here's the presenter I need, and here's the function. I'm sorry, the method I need inside landing page, inside my presenter, and it worked. We got them all rendered out here, all three entries from our table. It doesn't look very good, but I'm going to try to make that better with my Bootstrap 5 theme. And I think that the Bootstrap 5 thing will be really helpful. That template will be helpful because it'll kind of show off the functionality of the forms component in Nette. Nette's got a very useful and very flexible form component. It'll allow you to use your CSS library pretty easily. And that's pretty helpful. So that'll be coming up next. And then very soon after that, we'll be starting to work with CRUD functionality, create, read, update, and delete. We'll create a table, and then we'll also be using the HTMX Ajax library, and I think that'll be pretty handy to use. And we'll get this thing rolling. All right, we're ready to start including the Bootstrap 5 theme in our podcast collective site. But before we do that, I want to fix one thing that's bugging me. I would like for this to be our home page when we type in podcastcollective.test. Right now, we have to type in landing page welcome to get to this page. And if we just type in our virtual host, we get this instead, which is the pre-configured home page in Nette, and I want the one we created. So the challenge, of course, is, well, how do we overwrite this functionality, the one that says, here's how it works in Nette. You have to type in the presenter and the method if you want it as URL segments if you want to get to a particular page. How do I override this so that I get to where I want to be just when I type in podcastcollective.test? Well, of course, there's a method for that, a procedure, I guess, or a file to change, and we will do that. All right, so here it is. You'll need to go down under router, the router directory, routerfactory.php provides us this functionality to change the default behavior of going to a URL, first the presenter and then the method. And here's what we're going to do. So we're replacing the presenter and the action with something different than the home page default. We want it to go to landing page, the presenter that we created, and we want it to go to the method welcome render, and that's what we called our spell right, welcome render methods. We want to get, without having to type these in as segments in the URL after our domain name, we want this to be the default. If we don't include them, go here. So let's make sure that this works. Save that, and we'll see if it worked, and it did. So after refreshing it for collective.test, we no longer have the default that came with Nette. We have the presenter and the method that we chose as our home page for our virtual host. Okay, so enough on that. Let's go back now and start putting together our Bootstrap 5 theme and including it on our site. So here we go. So the first thing to do is we have to change out the layout.latte. I'll include the files that you need to make these changes in my GitHub repository. I'm thinking it's probably best to go ahead and just do some cutting and pasting at this point. There are much better template designers out there who can give you tutorials in this part, but it's likely if you've used just about done anything on the web lately, you probably run into Bootstrap. It's kind of ubiquitous now. It's everywhere, and it's good. Like I say, it's good to use a CSS framework when you're working on anything with web now. It's just the way it is now. You just kind of got to do it. All right. So here is what we're going to do. We are going to, if I can remember where I put it, we are going to, here it is. I'm going to change out this boilerplate code that we have here, and there's really not too much of it in the default. And we're going to make a whole new one here, and drop it in. Okay, and just by way of brief explanation, a few things that have changed. Obviously, we're including a nav bar. The nav bar will be something that we use in every page of our web application, so we might as well put it in the layout. And what else has changed? The theme I found was on a site called bootswatch.com, and it's called Spacelab. And hey, if you find something else you like more, please go ahead and use it. But it just worked for me. Just looked good, I thought. And nav bar, pretty typical stuff. Again, if you've worked with Bootstrap, we have a couple of links that right now don't work. We're going to hook them up as the tutorial progresses. Here are some of the libraries we'll be using, the JavaScript libraries we'll be using. This first one is part of the Nette application, and it is for error messages coming up when you're using forms. That needs to be needs to be a email address or whatever, not enough characters or whatever you decide. You can configure this just about any way you want. The next one, of course, is the Bootstrap JS bundle. We're going to need that one. And finally, there's the HTMX library, JavaScript library for issuing AJAX requests. And so that gives us all the script we need. And let's see, there's also a link to style sheet, our own, and in addition to the Spacelab one from Bootswatch. Okay, so all right, so let's save that and see if we get what we're expecting. And go back out here to podcastcollective.test, hit the button, and yeah, there we go. So we have this. This is a fixed nav bar, so we need to do a little fix in our style sheet to move the body down a little bit so it's not overwriting the very top. But I like the fonts better, and I like this better, and you know, I just like it a little better than the standard HTML stuff. So the next thing is let's fix this problem. It's kind of bugging me a little bit, and we're going to need to make a file under our web root here and our folder for our CSS files. And if you just make one called CSS, and then under there we'll make a style.css. And this is going to be super simple. For now, all we need to do is move that body tag down a little bit, and I'm just going to find it to paste it in, if I can. And yeah, there we go. So just change this body style a little bit. Paste that in. Okay, save that one. And if we go back, now in order for me to reload my CSS, I've got to go do a Control F5. I'm using Firefox, so I'm not sure what it might be for you, but in order for us to get that to work correctly, yeah, there we go. So now pop that Podcast Collective title down below the Podcast Collective link up here in the nav bar, and that's enough space for right now. And yeah, that looks okay. So the next thing to do is we've got to change our welcome.latte so that it includes the image and the cards that were on the landing page that I showed you in the beginning there. The one we want to kind of make it look like. Okay, and let's see. All right, so I'm gonna do it. I gotta find the other one here. Where'd it go? There we go. Okay, so this is a bit longer and a little more involved, and we're going to have more going on. So let me copy it off here and paste it in. I'm going to need to make a few changes to this one, and here we go. All right. So we're doing quite a bit here. We're adding a section in, putting in some text. We're getting, you know, things lined up correctly, adding some stuff. The one thing we need to do is put this this image directory in here, so we can get that image that I found at Undraw. Undraw has a collection of open source images that you can use in your website. And there's a lot of them. I just found one that I thought was appropriate for the Podcast Collective. We are going to need to make another folder under www to put the images in. So just img. I wonder how many times we've all done this. Created a put images under an image file folder. Okay, and I've got the file right here, and again I will include this in my GitHub repository. All right, let's save all this, and we've got to make a couple of changes. This is one where I was doing some experimenting, and this I'm looking for posts. Obviously, we're not doing posts anymore; we're doing podcasts. So let's change that out as we're you know, doing this for each loop. I want to make sure I'm getting the podcast and not looking for my posts any longer. Podcast for every podcast, not podcasts. For every podcasts. There it is. So for each, got to get that right here. For each podcast with an S as podcast. And if I don't do this right, the Tracy debugger tool will help me out. But I think I've got it here. So we're just you know, for eaching through a set of cards here to get what we're looking for on our landing page, on our home page. Okay, so let's save that one, and let's see if everything worked out the way it should. Yeah, that looks pretty good. Oh, this side kind of sucks. Got to fix that. But yeah, we've got this going. We got a little image. We got, this looks a little better. Join today. Yeah, except you can't because that button doesn't work. And of course we can't go to my collection yet. But here we go. At least we've got the homepage looking a little more spiffy. And we will carry on in the next segment as we move on to the kind of creating a table and getting ready to do some of the CRUD functionality. All right. We're ready to begin adding CRUD functionality to the Podcast Collective web application. And here's what I'm hoping to accomplish in this segment. What I want to do is I want to create a new presenter that will render this table, Bootstrap 5 table, kind of a control panel for our podcast so that we can run through the CRUD functionality sort of in one place. We can add individual podcasts, we can view them, we can edit and delete them. So that'll be kind of the first order of business, and we'll jump back over here to Visual Studio Code. There's a couple of kind of housekeeping items again to attend to make sure everything will work right, and I'll try to explain as we're going along what's happening here. The first one is, if you'll let me make this a little easier to read. The first one is we need to go into layout.latte, and you may remember that that's under presenters, templates, and then layout latte. I've already got it open here. There's a couple things that need to be done. And the first thing is, right now, layout.latte, as it comes to you from, the default condition from Nette, is going to be named like this. It'll have a little @ symbol in the front of latte, or layout, I'm sorry. And so it looks like that. You want to get rid of that, oops, got it wrong there. Let's do it right here. So yours likely looks like this. I need you to change the name by removing the @ symbol. This will make more sense as I get into explaining the HTMX library for AJAX requests. Basically, what I want to be sure that doesn't happen is I don't want the layout to be automatically included with every one of the latte templates that we create. We need to ask for them explicitly. So we want to get rid of that @ symbol. So just rename that one. And as long as we're here in the layout.latte, we might as well add a link for the control panel that we are about to create. And if you'll just put in this item right here, so we'll be able to link to our presenter podcasts and our method table contents when we make them, using that link right there. So, and I don't know if I've explained this, but this is just a foreshortening in Nette to just shorten up the fully qualified URL. You don't have to type in HTTP, podcastcollective.net, You can just keep it to the more simple, a little shorter. Podcast is the presenter, and table contents is our method that we'll be asking for. All right. So once you made those two changes, there's one last thing that we need to do here. In the landing page, welcome.latte, landing page, this is, again, is a template, landing.latte. So under templates, landing page, welcome.latte. I need to have you add this line. So now, because our layout is no longer going to be automatically included, it does need to be included in the welcome page, so we have to ask for it explicitly. So if you'll just type that in there, we're telling Latte to please include this layout, and it's we're going up a directory level, layout.latte. All right. So once those little items are out of the way, we're ready to create our new presenter, and that presenter is going to be, let me reduce this templates file here. Our new presenter is going to be podcastpresenter.php under the presenters folder. So let me walk you through this a little bit as you're typing away, and I'm not, right? And so here's the idea. So we're going to use Nette. The next three lines have to do with we're going to be creating forms in the next segment, so we need to get our component for forms. We're going to be downloading something called Bootstrap form from a site called Contribute, and it's a library that'll help us correctly render Bootstrap forms in the Bootstrap method, I guess. And we're going to need a couple of libraries there. And finally, we do have a dependency here for the podcast facade, our model. Because our podcast presenter is going to be handling all of the CRUD functionality for us, including rendering our control panel, our table. We're going to need our object, right? We're going to need to be manipulating our data object, and so we're going to need an instance of podcast facade, and our class will be called podcast presenter. It's extending the base presenter in Nette. We're going to declare a property facade, which will be the container for our dependency, our instance of podcast facade. And you may remember we're using the constructor injection method here. We're passing our dependencies as a parameter to our constructor. So we'll get an instance of podcast facade for us to use. And again, we're using this keyword for facade so we can use it within our methods that we're creating in our class. And finally, for right now, we're just going to create two methods. The first one is render table contents. That'll be what creates the table that we'll be using to kind of as our control panel. And this is very similar to what you've done in the past. We're going to create a template here soon that will have a variable called podcast. We're going to iterate through that podcast list, do it with a for each loop. And we're assigning podcast the value of our instance of our data object instance, which we get from invoking get all podcasts. All right, we got one more to create in this class for right now, and that's render show. And this will allow us to render just a single podcast entry. And of course, we're going to need to pass it a parameter here, a podcast ID, which we'll create. And we're asking for a different template now, and the variable in that template will be podcast. We're going to assign podcast the value of our data object, and we're going to use this to get just one podcast instead of getting all that we have in our data set. All right, so with that, we're about ready to begin creating our latte templates, and so we'll go ahead and do that. And under templates, now we're going to create a new folder called podcast, and we're going to create just two for right now. We're going to create the table contents, and then we're going to create the show contents. So let's take a look at the table contents first. Okay, and again, on this one we will need the layout, so you'll have to explicitly ask for it. We're creating some block content here. And here's a new thing. This is where we're starting to look at using our HTMX library, and these are HTML attributes that we'll need to include, and I'll be explaining that in just a minute here and showing you how that works. We're going to create a container, some Bootstrap 5 stuff here to help us get it to render correctly and use the Bootstrap library. I'm giving it a little space here in this div just to give us a little. This just means I'm asking for padding in the y-axis on both the top and the bottom of 5. I'll talk about this later. This is a div that includes our flash messages that are available in Nette, and they're basically messages that say like, hey, successfully added or successfully deleted or successfully updated a particular entry in your table, podcast entry. If you get a successful form and everything worked right, it'll give you a flash message. And I'll show you how we use that. And we're going to have a bunch of buttons here that don't work yet, but they will. The only one that we're interested in getting to work is down here in the for each loop. We're running through our podcast entries in our data object. And we do want to have a link to podcast show with that particular ID number. We need to be able to pass along this parameter of that particular ID, podcast ID. So yeah, so we'll have one of them rolling here, which is really great. Before we take a look at the HTMX library, and I'll detail that out a little bit, let's go ahead and make one more on our final latte template, and that's underneath podcast. Create a file called show.latte, and it looks like this. Again, we're going to have this funny looking div with the hx target this and hx swap outer HTML. I'll explain that in just a second here. We'll give it a little bit of spacing. And basically it's just going to give us a title and the content for our individual podcasts. Then we're going to put another div in here that will create a button that will get us back to podcast table contents. So that'll complete what it is that we're doing here. All right. So once you've completed creating that entry, let's go back and take a look at our site. I'll begin to kind of explain what's going on with these HTMX files. And here's what it is that we're attempting to do with our project. So in our data file. So going back to podcastcollective.test, and we'll go back podcast collective and just click to my collection. And we've got everything done and saved. That should get you here. And remember, we only have one of the buttons working, and that's the view button. And so what I'm trying to do is have something happen. When I click this view button, what I want to do is I want to replace the entire div that this table resides in with the contents of a single podcast entry. So when I click this, I don't want to do a page refresh. I just want to replace this div with the contents of my podcast, and it works. And I'll explain exactly how that happens when we go back to look at our code. As you can see, our initial request was, Tracy's saying, hey, you just did a hard, you went right to the URL and you got the whole page. But the next request that you made when I clicked from the table to this individual entry was an AJAX request. And we're going to give another AJAX request back to podcasts. There's a second one right here that gets us back to the table. So let me explain a little bit about what's going on. And I think the best way to do this is go back to our code in Visual Studio Code. And let's take a look at the table contents, where we have it's kind of our initial page here. This shows up when we link to my collection. And here's the idea. So the first thing that's happening is that HTMX is issuing a GET request with this attribute inside of our CSS, our HTML attribute. It's issuing a GET request, and it's an AJAX GET request, and it's saying go out and get this particular this presenter and this method. Whatever happens here, and remember what we're doing is we're rendering a template. We're rendering the template called show.latte. So it renders an HTML individual file. Take that result and place it into the target that's named this HX target. And this is a keyword in HTMX. And what it means is it says, hey, look for if this link, if this GET request exists inside this div, and clearly this button is nested inside this div right here. Replace whatever this result is here. Replace everything in that div, including the div itself. Replace everything with this result. And that's exactly what's happening, right? And that's just one of the things that HTMX can do, but it's pretty handy. Let's go ahead and take a look at where HTMX comes from, and I'll give you just a brief overview of what's happening there. As I understand it, here's HTMX, htmx.org. And so the notion is, I don't know if you're familiar with this, but what an AJAX request is, and just kind of in a nutshell as an overview, AJAX stands for Asynchronous JavaScript and XML. And it's kind of an antiquated term almost now. You don't usually use XML so much. But the idea with AJAX is, hey, I want to be able to have the ability in a web page to make a request of the web server without re-rendering the entire page. Right? I just want to get some information and perhaps place it in a particular div or particular portion of my page, but I don't want to refresh the whole page. I'm tired of all that jumping around. I really don't want to get everything all over again. And it's become every website uses AJAX because it just makes the user experience so much better, really. And AJAX is great. It has the limitation of kind of standard AJAX is that what you're dealing with is you're kind of trafficking in JavaScript objects, using JavaScript object notation. You send out a JavaScript request, JavaScript object or JSON object, I guess is a better way to describe it, and then the server sends you back a JSON object, and then what you have to do before it can be rendered to the browser, because the browser can't render AJAX, you have to rebuild the JSON object and re-render HTML. And so you got to cut through the thing, I iterate over through the object and put in your tags, and you just it's a lot of work. It can be a lot of work. You're dealing with lots and lots of fun JavaScript. Nothing wrong with that. You should know JavaScript. It's great. But boy, HTMX makes that so much easier because instead of having to rebuild that object, that JSON object, it's simply if your browser or your web server can send out HTML, and it will. What it feels like it's happening is it's sending HTML over the wire, right? I'm sending out a request and I'm passing back. Feels like HTML. So it kind of shortcuts that whole business of having to deal with a JSON object. I'm not sure what's going on behind the scenes in HTMX, but it is a great idea. It really helps. And what we're doing is relatively simple. Replacing a div with the contents of an AJAX request. But boy, it sure makes working with web development frameworks, particularly back-end ones like Nette, it's developed in PHP. It makes working with it much easier because you can now leverage the power of your templating engines to create HTML without having to work directly with JSON. And it's a great thing, and it's really slick, and I think it works really well. So, all right, so let's go back again. I just want to retouch on what's going on in this system. So once we've done this, we click this link, we fired off our GET request. It's repopulated this div that we've called this, the HX target div. It's replaced it with our single show, render to show instance, and showing that particular podcast ID, just the one. And so it looks like this in the browser, right? We're back here again. Whoop, let me do it. Whoop, got it back to where we were. NetWeb. Okay, here we are again. Let's take a look at this one. Now we're getting one. We've swapped it out. We swapped out the table div with this. And now we can go back to podcast by doing the same thing sort of in reverse. We'll hit back podcast, and there we are. We replaced the single instance of a podcast, that div, with the div that contains the table. And here are the instructions that we wrote to make that happen. That's over in the show latte, right? So here we are, we're just doing it in reverse. We're now in the podcast details where we get one. We have a button that says, here's my GET request. Go back and get the podcast table contents for me this time and replace everything within this target div with the table contents. So we can just do that all day. We can keep flipping back and forth, and it just really works well. It makes it relatively intuitive. You're kind of doing like a switch going off and on, and it's super handy. So I think that about sums up what I'm hoping to accomplish here in this segment. We got everything there. I'm checking my list. Yep, we removed the @ symbol for layout. That's good. We added our link on the welcome page. And yeah, we got our presenter created, podcast presenter, filled that up, right? And we made our two initial latte templates. And so we've got our first stab here at our CRUD functionality, just with the read aspect of our CRUD functionality and viewing a single entry for our podcasts. We've got a little control panel built, and we're starting to work with AJAX requests using HTMX. So we're on our way. All right, next segment, we're going to be finishing our CRUD functionality for our podcast collective and getting to adding, editing, and deleting individual podcasts. All right. Before we include the functionality to add, edit, and delete podcasts entries in our podcast collective web app, we need to go out and install an extension to Nette to help us work with Bootstrap 5 forms. So if you'll cruise on over to contribute.org and simply type in Bootstrap, should get a link to contribute forms-bootstrap. This will give you some examples and some instructions for how to use this extension. I'll show you how to install the extension using Composer in Visual Studio Code. And probably let me reduce some of these a little bit. First thing to do is you'll need to open a terminal. And we're going to be using Composer to install this extension. And let's see if we can find it. There it is. So simply type in at the command line here, or at the terminal, Composer require contribute forms-bootstrap. And once you've done that, contribute will be installed as a folder under the vendor directory. So it's right here, and it will include everything you need for all the dependencies for Bootstrap forms. And the next thing you'll need to do is to change the permissions on the contribute file. And that's going to look like this. What you'll need to do, though, it's the right command but wrong location. We need to get down to the vendor. Oh, let me type in vendor here. So we want to make sure we get all the way down to vendor contributed from our podcast collective folder. Simply follow the prompts after you enter that command, and you'll be ready to go. And we'll be ready to make some changes to our application to include our final elements of a CRUD functionality. Okay, let's reduce this one. And let's begin by, I think the easiest way to do this, or perhaps the best approach, is to first let's make these links so that they will work when we create our new methods in our podcast presenter. So let's start with this. Just copy this one from our view component. What we'll be doing for edit, delete, and add is very similar. Instead of replacing the table contents with a view of a particular podcast entry, we're going to want the form for edit, delete, or add to appear and take the place of our table contents. So we're issuing an HTMX AJAX request to get a form to fill in. So let's paste that in. When it comes to, now it's not going to be a show method now. The method we're going to create is going to be called, for edit, it'll be called edit. And for delete, it'll be called delete. And still rendering an HTMX AJAX request to get that form. And this will be delete. In both edit and delete instances, we need to pass the correct podcast ID, just like we did with the show method here. Finally, let's get a get request for our add form. Paste that one in. We don't have to include podcast ID because, as you may remember, it's an auto incrementing field in our table. The method we'll be looking for in our podcast presenter will be add, for adding. So all those should be working now once we create the methods that we need in our podcast presenter. So we'll be doing that next. Let's save this one. Okay, let's move over into podcast presenter. And this is all we have right now in our podcast presenter. I kind of walked through that before. We only have these two methods that we've created beyond our constructor method to get an instance of our podcast data object. And that was render table contents so we can get our control panel, and then render show so we can show an individual entry for a podcast. And now we're going to enter the last elements of our CRUD functionality for our site. So kind of a lot going on here, so let me cut and paste this in. Let's take just a second here. I don't want to miss anything. Okay. Looks like everything. Copy that. Paste it in. All right. There's a fair amount going on here, so let me walk you through it. Okay. So scrolling up here to, all the way back up here to render show. Just after render show, this first new method that we're creating is called action add. And we haven't seen this this action notion before, but add will be the method, the name of the method that's going to will result in this method running. It'll be add. So this is what we're going to do to add a new entry. And what this method does is it does a couple of things for us. It starts out by creating the form for us, the form itself, the empty form, and then it also goes to this next step, which is if there's a successful form submission, then do this step, which is to move us on to a method called add form succeeded, which we will be creating. And basically what this method does is it updates our data object and saves it back to our database, and then moves us forward, kind of gives us a flash message that says it was successfully added, and gets us back to our control panel. And I'll explain that when we get to creating this method. We're creating a similar method called action edit, which can be reached by asking for podcast edit. Pardon me. And it does a similar thing, although the difference here, of course, is that because we're editing an existing podcast entry, we got to get its number, we got to get its ID, and we got to fill in that form with that particular entry for that podcast. So we need an instance of our data object, and we need to get the specific entry that we want, a specific podcast that we want. We need to render the form, and then we need to set the defaults for the form for this particular podcast. So we're going to set the defaults in there because we're editing an existing one. And then after we made the edits, if it's a successful form submission, then we need to move on to a different method that we will be calling edit form succeeded. All right. So we're basically doing everything we need to do to render the form and then do something with that form once it's been submitted in these two methods, add and edit. Now, creating the form itself, getting all the elements of the form put together, is the responsibility of this particular method called create component podcast form. So we're using the form component within Nette to basically build the building blocks of rendering a form. In our particular case, we want to use a kind of form, the Bootstrap form. And so we're going to invoke that, but first of all, we need to get the version that we need. So we need to enter in this line, get version 5. The form that we're creating will be a new Bootstrap form. And we're going to add these elements to our form. First, we're going to add the text field for title. The name of the field to be the text field will be title, and its label will be title, capital T. We're going to ask for it to be set it to be required. So if you don't fill it in, the form will not move forward. You can't submit it; it'll render an error. Say next element of our form is going to be a text area. Its name will be content. Its label will be content with capital C, and we're going to make that required as well. So if you don't type any content in for your podcast, you can't. The form will not be submitted. It'll render an error in the form. Okay, we're going to add some particular elements to this form depending upon the action that the user has requested. So if the action that the user requested was an add, he's asking for the add method, he or she, then the form will include a button that says its name will be placeholder and its value will be saved because we're saving a new one. And then we're going to, on this button, we're going to add an attribute, HX post, because now we need an HTMX AJAX request, and we need to make a post request. Now we're posting a completed form, and now we need to make sure that we go to the correct method in our podcast presenter called add, so that we get that next step in the function that we've created, so that it will do something with that form, okay, and it will do the correct thing, which is add. However, else if the action that the user is requesting was edit, then we need to have a button. This time the button's value will be save changes. Its name will be placeholder, and I'll explain that in just a second. And the attributes we need for this button in order to use HTMX will be HX post, and it's a post request. We're posting a form back to our web server. This time we want to get the podcast presenter, but we want to get the edit method, and of course we need to include a podcast ID, which is a parameter in our form. Okay, let me explain what's going on with this placeholder and this notion of set emitted. So Nette's form component makes an assumption is if you've included an element on your form using this methodology, creating the form using this create component, Nette is assuming that this placeholder, this named element of the form, has some space. This exists in your data object placeholder, just like title exists and just like content exists. Those names map against the table that we've created for our podcast. There's nothing in our data object that's called placeholder. So we need to omit this from the functionality that Nette has, how it helps us manipulate our data object. Don't try to manipulate anything in the data object called placeholder because it doesn't exist. So omit that from what you do, Nette, to help us manipulate and work with our data object. So in both instances, we need to see the button, and we need to have this HX post attribute included so that we can use the HTMX AJAX functionality, but we do not anticipate, there's nothing here, no button called, or no space in our table called placeholder. So please omit it in both instances here. Finally, return the form. So I want to render the form in my template, which brings us to creating forms for both, or creating templates for both types of forms, both an edit form and and a add form. So you're going to need to make two of them in your presenters, and then in your templates, and under podcast. You can create two more. Actually, you need to create three more. But let's do two right now, both the add and the edit latte templates. Very similar to our show latte template. We need an HX target, so it will replace this with the table contents when we ask it to. This is a new command here, a new function, and it's calling for a control that we've named podcast form. That's our form component. So Nette is building all the elements of the form for us here using that component functionality, so we don't have to type anything in to create this form. That's going to be created for us automatically using the Nette form component. And here's what it looks like on our site. So let's move back out to our web browser, and let's go back to our deal. Let's make sure we've updated. Oh no! Podcast edit. What did we do wrong? I think it's because I didn't save everything, right? So podcast presenter. Yep, I forgot to save it. That happens all the time to me. I'm going to save that one. Now it should work just fine. Let's here. There we go. So now, now that we've created our functionality for both editing and adding, we can ask for a new one here. Let's try this one. So add one. There it is. Our form's rendered correctly, and it looks pretty nice. Nice Bootstrap form. If I try to save it right now, of course, I get my errors, and they look nice. They're very bootstrappy, just like we want them to be. If I add a title in here, and I'll just put in some gibberish. If I do try it now, well, I got that right, but I still don't have any content. Still required. Okay. I'm not going to do the submission yet because I want to explain what happens when we hit the save button, and that's back in our podcast presenter. The next methods that we'll be talking about are those edit and add components. Let's go back there, and here we go. Now we have this function called add form succeeded. What happens when we hit the button? Well, our action marches through to the next step in our what we need to do, and it asks for this method, add form succeeded. So what it does is it takes our form and it gets an instance of our data object. It passes the data from the form into our object using this insert command here. And then it delivers a flash message. We talked about that a little bit. It says successfully added to podcast table contents. That's the next place it goes to. So when I hit save and everything worked out right, it will give us it'll add a new instance of a new podcast entry into our data object, and it will give us a message that says successfully added as a flash message in podcast table contents, and this will forward us to table contents. It's successfully using HTMX. So let's see what it looks like in action. Back here we left off at new podcast. Let's put in some real content here. Let's put in something that's not gibberish here. I don't know. A new terrific new great podcast. I don't know. Something. And then we'll put gibberish in here. Okay. So let's save it and see what happens. There it is. Our great new podcast is here. We've successfully added it, and it works. All right. So let's see what happens now if we want to edit a particular instance here. Let's go back to, I don't know, here, daily dad joke. I think I already edited it once. Let's do it again. We edit it. So it correctly fills it in. Remember, we created that functionality. Correctly fills it in. And if I say now that this is dad joke number 3, and I'll put a 3 in here just so we see that we made an update, and we save the changes. Before we save the changes, let's look at that particular method in Visual Studio Code. I'm clicking all around here, but I think it might be helpful to see what's going on. Now we're going to be asking for the edit form succeeded method. Remember, when we hit that save changes button, it's got to get that podcast for us. It gets the parameter podcast ID and assigns it to podcast ID because we need that. We're again getting an instance of our data object. This time we're getting a specific entry, and we're updating that entry with the data that comes from our form. All right. Once again, we're going to give a flash message that says successfully updated, and we're going to forward on to podcast table contents, and changing that page out from our form to our control panel. Which will also include the message successfully updated. All right. Might want to be sure I mention how to make the edit latte form, edit latte template here. Oh, looks almost exactly like our add latte template, except it's edit latte, and we just need to do this. This is probably ripe for some kind of refactoring, but at this point, because the action we're asking for is add, we're going to get an add latte. And when we ask for the add action, we're going to get the add latte. When we ask for the edit action, we're going to get the edit latte. So we need to have two distinctly named latte templates. And again, we're pulling up that podcast form, okay, that we've created. Okay, so let me go back to Podcast Presenter now that we've reviewed both these latte templates, Podcast Presenter here. And I think we've already talked about what happens when the edit form succeeded. If we get a successful submission of the edit form, marches us through what we need to do to update our data object and returns us to table contents with a flash message successfully updated. So that's what we'll anticipate happening when we go back to Podcast Collective. We're still here. And we're going to say Save Changes. All we did is change the number to 3. Hit Save Changes. And there we go. Worked correctly. Got us back to our control panel, and it gave us the message successfully updated. So we only have one last element of our CRUD functionality to include, and that's delete. And so let's go back to our Podcast Presenter, and I'll walk you through how that works. So marching down here to render delete, a little bit saying we're going to render a particular latte template, which is the delete template, which I'll be showing to you in just a second. Again, in order for this to work, we got to pass on a particular podcast ID as a parameter. We need to invoke an instance of our data object, and this time we're getting a specific podcast ID. If we don't have a podcast, we probably ought to throw out an error. If we do, then we're going to get the template, and the variable in our template is going to be podcast. It's going to have the value of our particular podcast, and we're going to get a component delete form, which we will be creating, because we're going to use the form methodology to pass this information to our presenter and tell it which one to delete. And then if we get a successful submission of the form, we're going to get our parameter podcast ID, and if we have the ID, this is what we're going to do. We're going to get an instance of our podcast, and we're going to delete it, and we're just going to issue a delete command. We're going to return a flash message saying the podcast has been deleted, and we're going to forward it to the table contents, just like we did with add and edit. We're also going to add an additional method here. If there's not an additional method, but if we didn't get a podcast, somehow it didn't work, didn't correctly get one, we're going to issue a podcast not found message. And finally, we are going to have a canceled method, so that we're going to create a button for canceled on our delete form. So if we made a mistake and we want to cancel our deletion, we'll be forwarded to podcast table contents without the form being submitted. So that means we got to take a look now at our delete.latte up here, and it just says we got a form. We're not doing a control and then rendering a component that way. We're just rendering it on our own, and we're putting a button that says delete, and that sends us on to the delete function, or cancel, which sends us on to the cancel function. So we just go back to the table contents. So that's how we do the delete functionality of our podcast collective. So let's go back. Everything's been saved. Let's go back and make sure everything works. We can add a new one, right? Did we do that already? I think we did. So, oh man, I don't need that. So, what am I doing? So, new one, new podcast, right? podcast. I'm a little sleepy. Hear me out. Okay. More gibberish, and we save it. That looks good. New podcast. Yeah, here we go. Let's edit it. New podcast 45, and content 45. Save changes. See if that works. Oh, there it worked. That's great. And now let's get rid of it. See if that works. Say, are you sure you want to delete this new one? Yep, I am. Delete. Bang. So everything works, and HTMX works like it's supposed to. And so there we go. In the next video that I create, I'm going to move on to working with a component in Nette for authorization and authentication, so we can set up users who have access to just their specific collections. All right. Thank you for watching.